Hi, I'm Crystal, she, her. In 3 words, my research is broadly about tech, power, and disability. As a researcher in science and technology studies specializing in data visualizations, talking to cartographers, I don't really need to extol the virtues of maps all day, every day. They're crucial for thinking about mobility, for example, and play a huge role in thinking about the built environment. So who gets to access these maps? And what does access mean anyways? Drawing from our 2 previous examples means being able to find out where to transfer from Notting Hill to Piccadilly Circus, and to engage meaningfully in critical conversations about urban planning. As historian Bess Williamson puts it, in its most literal form, access describes the ability to enter into, move about within, and operate the facilities of a site. Figuratively, it can suggest a much broader set of meanings linked to a more inclusive society. A focus on access is a shift away from attempts to fix or cure disability on an individual level, the medical model, and towards an emphasis on social and legal interventions, or the social model. Let's break that down a little bit. What's the medical model of disability? In this model, people are disabled by their impairments, which should then be fixed by medical treatments. In other words, we find the body is faulty. So the question is, what can we do to get them out of a wheelchair? In the social model, people are disabled by the way that society is organized and not by their impairments, in which case we identify the problem in the environment. What can we do to make sure that there are wheelchair ramps? So what does any of this have to do with map making? Well, how do you design maps that take disabilities like blind or low vision into account? And how do we design meaningful multisensory experiences? To get there, let's look at some historical examples.
At the Perkins Institution for the Blind in Watertown, a project is underway involving the development of map-making machines and the embossing of plates for raised maps, making possible the study of geography by the blind. Another project in Boston has completed the publication in braille of 15 important literary works and a map and street index of the city. The proofreading on these projects is done by sightless experts in braille. In the Boston district, instruction is given in the reading of braille maps. The publications of this project will be made available to public institutions.
So, how is a tactile map made? Before we get into something as complex as this tactile map of MIT or conversations about symbols, let's talk about how we get from geographically accurate maps of the London Tube to diagrammatic ones. So it's clear that the modern tube map rethinks assumptions about what the data is and can be used for, and it adapts the format accordingly. What is actually necessary for visual representations to be useful? Now, some might point to Tufte's data ink ratio to illustrate the virtues of minimalist design, but let's crypt this framework and see how tactile maps can learn from disabled people who have long pioneered this work. The making of tactile graphics have long relied on the artisanal, bespoke work of braille transcriptionists, which, unsurprisingly, were largely done by women. These tools largely relied on the transcriptionists to raise outlines and to create textures, which could be done individually or, more recently, conducted by thermoform machines with swell paper. But let's come back to the map of Massachusetts, which has been interpreted in a haptic way. Tactile graphics have been a mainstay in blind education, and what's compelling about these graphics is that they're designed to be read processually. Rather than focus on a synoptic view and zoom in, tactile maps require context and step-by-step reading, moving from top to bottom. So, as a provocation, let's take up earlier research agenda in textual mapping and to consider redesigning maps in a way that centers disability rather than thinking of it as an afterthought. Braille and tactile graphics have a long history of innovation with tactile shorthand and essential interventions. In In the words of disability justice activist Annie Sagara, the future is accessible.
I have to say, this video has been getting some rave reviews on the Slack channel right now. I have a rave review to give for it myself. So tell us a bit more about what you do, what your research involves and entails, and what you're interested in.
Thanks so much, Alex. Yeah, I mean, I feel like in a lot of ways I intended the video to be a provocation. I'm still in some ways at the beginning of this project, in the sense that I'm doing a history and ethnography of tactile information systems. That's a kind of larger project that I'm thinking about. And I think I'm trying to use that to inform the design of new multimodal strategies. But I feel like for me, I'm really curious to hear what the cartographic and the cartographic community has to say about a lot of these things. So I'm really just hoping to get lots of comments and questions to minimize what I have to say, to hear what everyone else does.
Yeah, I think I agree. This is kind of a topic that deserves a dialogue, even more so than just one person presenting his or her ideas. And I guess I could start with my own experience, with these types of maps. At the University of Alabama's map library, we actually had a tactile map of Mexico hanging up on our walls. You would have like little pieces of foam to represent the Central Plateau in Mexico, and they would have string to represent the Sierra Madre all across, around the country as well. And I believe it was actually made by local school children out of the suburb of Birmingham for students who were visually impaired. And that always left it left an awesome impression on me, because up until that point I had never come across something like that before. I guess that's my experience with them, certainly limited as it is. I want to learn a lot more about these because I just find them awesome. But my experiences aside, it does look like we have some questions in the Slack. And so Jesse Braden, I do apologize in advance if I mispronounce anybody's names. I'm terrible at that. But Jesse Braden asked you, Crystal, how do we bring these kinds of maps to the web?
Yeah, this is a big question, and it's something that I'm working on with one of my collaborators in the visualization group at MIT. I think in a lot of ways, the best thing that we still have is alt text and just actual descriptions of what the visualization says. I think a lot of that terrain is still pretty untrodden, so to speak. There are a few places that have like best practices for this kind of stuff, but like trying to do that automatically is something that like Facebook is trying to crack in really problematic ways. But I think we're really trying to brainstorm ways to do that in an inclusive way. So is it okay if I just continue?
Yeah, you go right ahead.
Yeah, this is a question from Ariel about TIST or alt text on map images. I mean, I think, like, as I said in the presentation, it really, like, I think there's a way to kind of literally describe what's happening, but I think usually when we put maps, we're trying to make some other argument, and being really explicit about what that other argument is and how the visual representation contributes to that, I think is a really, really big part of like rethinking and reframing our approaches to multimodal presentation.
Guys, we still have several more minutes for you all to submit questions. Send them at them if you have them for Crystal. Now, I'm curious what brought you into this, this line of study, because it's fascinating and there's obviously a desperate need for it. So what personally inspired you to do
So I will say that I started grad school thinking a lot about data visualization and its practice. And I mean, I think in a lot of ways, it's like a really sexy thing to talk about. And I mean, especially now, given like flatten the curve and like the election. But I mean, I think at the same time, I was still engaging a lot with like multisensory visualizations. And I think in computer science and engineering, anyways, the impulse is often to do a kind of simplistic sensory translation. So like if you have a bar graph, then to make it tactile and accessible, the idea was just to like 3D print the bar graph, which in a lot of ways is A, unsatisfying, B, often requires more work than like just describing it. And I really wanted to challenge the notion, like the simplistic notions about like just 3D printing a bar graph. And what I found really compelling with a lot of this literature is that they would always say that it's like ostensibly for people with disabilities, and then you just like never see any disabled person ever. Like they're just like the kind of throwaway line. So I've been thinking a lot about like what it actually means to put disability studies in conversation with computer science. So I feel like that has been my big project, trying to crip a super ableist discipline.
No, definitely something worth exploring. And, I think we're all grateful that you've gone down, started doing this. We do have more questions now. Let's see.
If you give me like 30 seconds, I'll just read them and see if I can answer them together. Because I know we're short. How many more minutes do I have?
We have about 3.5 minutes, actually.
Okay.
So. And thank you guys on Slack for the awesome feedback and for bringing in the questions.
Okay, I don't know if I will be able to answer all of them in 3 minutes, so happy to talk more on Slack.
Awesome.
So when it comes to annotations and legends, there's certainly a lot of best practices through like the Braille Association of North America, but the problem with annotation and legends is that they're not standardized, and for good reason. And so essentially what ends up happening is, because a blind person has to move through the visualization processually, like from the left corner slowly to the right corner or up and down, it means that like there isn't a way for a blind person to like see the visualization and then identify immediately where the annotation is. I know that there are a lot of attempts now, or in the last 10 years, to basically have like the annotation be to one side and then a blind person can use the pen to basically trigger an audio description, whereas like the actual like line graph, for example, or the map is still tactile. So you're basically pressing the pen in different places where it prompts you to. So in some ways it's like a museum audio guide. How do maps differ from other types of visualization? I mean, so I guess I'm coming back to the part to whole to part distinction again. I don't think I mentioned that in the video, but basically like having a synoptic view and then zooming in would be like, we look at the whole and then titrate down to the part, whereas usually blind and visually impaired people do it the other way around. And so, I mean, I think maps in particular have this synoptic, like whole to part problem, insofar as like you can't go to like the map of the US automatically. Like you have to go from California all the way to Maine. So I think having to think about that is more like requires more work, just because it's not on an axis. Like you can't move from like the legend to the other part of the graph.
Yeah, we probably have time for just one more question.
Yeah. What resources do I recommend? I will write a Twitter thread about this as this panel unfolds.
Awesome.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Yeah, that'll probably wrap it up. Keep the questions coming, guys. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much, Crystal.
Thanks.
This has been wonderful.